Welcome back to the Mog Effect, the vodcast where we unpack the chaos and clarity of digital transformation during machinery of government changes. I'm Julia Topless, Digital Practice Lead at Salsa. Prior to that, I worked for several years on government based websites, and then before that, I owned my own business for over 20 years. Over to you, Akil.
Yep, and I'm Akhil Bandari. So working with Salsa for the last 6 years in business development and with engagement management, and before that for 8 years in federal government in the Department of Communication and the Arts. So today we're diving into one of the most common and most publicly visible outcomes of a MOG and changes. It's managing the content chaos while maintaining citizen trust. When departments merge or functions shift, it's not just about who signs the approvals, but it's about the rewriting the narrative, making sure that users can still find what they need and ensuring that everything looks and feels like it belongs together.
So, Akil, let's start at the beginning, where most digital teams land right after a MOG hits. You're suddenly staring down the barrel of three, maybe four websites and now need to come together or pull apart. Where do you even begin with the IA and content cleanup?
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming at first, but the trick is to really start simple and act fast. So having a look at the first thing to do is probably do a lightweight content audit across all the affected sites, and just to get visibility in what's in the sites and getting a feel for the different sites, especially if it's a new site to that department. If it's coming into you, you may not be as familiar with the content that's coming in. And then it's just about applying a basic kind of ROT analysis, looking at the content that's redundant, outdated, or trivial ROT. And that helps us triage what's worth keeping and what can be going straight to the archive pile. From there, we start aligning everything to the new structure of the department, depending on if you're actually bringing new content in. And to be, let's be honest, right? A mock change usually brings shifts in both the ministerial portfolios or the business units and functions themselves. So the IA, which is the information architecture has to reflect the new shape of, and while shaping that new, while everyone is still working on the site.
Right, so you're not just moving pages around, it's more like a total content renovation. Is that how you would see it?
Yeah, mostly it's a renovation. Maybe it's a time for a spring clean. Is probably another way to look at it, right? So, MOG isn't necessarily a lift and shift. You know, you've got to look at the content, the way it's written, and rethink the narrative. In some cases, if a department's function has changed or has added a new function, then that narrative has to be added to the website, whether it's on the main page, if it's a really large election promise, which has happened in this MOG, that a department's picked up something that's a very large initiative. They need to add that into their narrative and to the homepage, into the different areas of the website, and that. And because the content needs to be technically correct, but no longer fits within new policy context or tone of voice, it could have things that move out of there. So things need to be adjusted as you're looking into these changes. You're also looking at the analytics, service demand, and sometimes even cross-agency duplication, making sure that there's no content that's living in multiple places or is slightly different in different places on the same site. Especially if similar programs existed across different sites, or if there was a program that was spanned different agencies, which they can have a multi-agency program. You need to make sure that there's, a single point of truth or less, having more clarity for the end user to be able to find the information they're looking for. And that's where the consolidation and consistency is really important.
Right. So we touched on structure and ownership quite a bit in our last episode. So let's park governance for now. From a pure content perspective, what's the biggest challenge you've come up against during a MOG?
Yeah, that's it's a big call on governance. It's the backdrop, but within the weeds and the real content challenge is the content sprawl or fragmentation. You suddenly inherit thousands of pages in some cases, and often having to look at the way that it's been written. But even within that 1,000 pages from another site, that could be written in different ways and different using different standards because that content could have been mogged before that. You don't know what happens in that kind of knock-on effect. So having a look at the content and the way that it's been written and potentially having to look at every single page is an important step to make sure you get a sense of everything that's going to fit into that one site, the new site. When you're dealing with duplication and overlapping service information, different versions of the same content or worse, conflicting advice, that'd be the worst thing. Living on two different domains is another issue or another thing to be mindful of.
So even when the content is technically accurate, it can be messy or misleading, just by how it's surfaced or structured.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So users aren't too concerned about, who owns the content or where it's supposed to be. They're just looking for that information to understand the service itself. But during a MOG, that can change. And if you have multiple MOGs, or sometimes the MOGs, which are like the one we've had now, which is a federal election, is a planned one. If a MOG is not planned, then that can also throw things off, right? And then you have pages that are factually correct but completely misaligned in tone or outdated, or sometimes even just orphaned. Sometimes if you have content that's been restructured, if you change the IA and take a section of the content away, pages might become orphaned, even though they're supposed to live on that kind of original site. A section's been taken away. Some pages may break and just be orphaned, and they don't get noticed in the IA. So you have content that's kind of living there or kind of just hanging about for no reason. And then there's a volume of content itself, right? So there's teams don't realize how much content is actually live until there's a MOG in it or an audit, some kind of process to make them go through every single back thing in the site itself. And we've seen departments with thousands of pages, half of which have not been touched for years. And now someone has to decide to do what to do with it. In some cases, if there is never enough time, but if there's time, you can obviously just review pages and bring across only what's relevant. But often the case is you need to bring everything across and then do it later whenever that happens.
And I can imagine that pressure really pushes teams into just keeping everything just in case. Like it'd be hard, right, to retire or archive under that sort
Yeah,
of pressure.
exactly. So when key things come over, especially if a new team's not as familiar with the history of that content, the last thing they want to do is delete stuff without knowing why it's there and if it needs to be there, and that creates its own risk, confusion, and inconsistency with the performance issues with having multiple. Lots of content, right? Thousands of pages. So you're far better off triaging properly than potentially migrating if you can, if that's possible.
Okay, so you've got all this content. Some of it might be duplicated, some of it just old. When you're looking at thousands of pages, how do you even begin to decide what's worth keeping, what gets archived, and what needs a rewrite?
Yeah, it's in some cases it's a massive task. I've been involved with migrations which had 20,000 content pages
Wow.
and 21,000 files and assets that had to come across. That's 40,000 things that had to get migrated. It all came across. But the key is not to treat everything as equal, right? We want to start looking at triaging framework. That's something that's lightweight, as I mentioned before, like the ROT, the redundant, outdated, or trivial. That helps us eliminate kind of low value content quickly. Then we look at the analytics, what's actually being used, because in some cases, areas will go, hey, this is a very important page. But when you look at the analytics, no one's visited in 1 year. It's really common. Right. So is it really that important or is it important for the department, right? We're always looking at the user first. So ideally, we're making sure that content that users are looking for and using is definitely maintained versus things that may not necessarily need to be there or could be consolidated onto somewhere else, right? And yeah, if no one's visiting that, then it's probably a good chance that you might not need it, or it could be rewritten to something else.
I'm listening really carefully, Akil. I'm about to enter into a project where we're doing exactly this type of activity so that the ROT analysis is going to be a really useful tool for me to bring into that project, which is great. So thanks for that tip. And I guess,
Welcome.
we're kind of really thinking, you're really thinking about combining qualitative input with quantitative signals, right?
Yeah, so we layer the business priority with public facing impact, right? So something may not have traffic yet, but if it's tied with the ministerial priority or upcoming service rollout, it might get bumped up. There may be pages of content that is there in preparation for something in the future, or something that might change later on. Sometimes it's legislative, so it needs to stay there. In which case, there's not much you can do about that. And then sometimes there's stuff that needs to be rewritten, not because it's incorrect, but it no longer fits. So whether there's a change in tone or voice, or even kind of the underlying shift in policy might make the language or the angle of the content change, right? So it needs to be updated. So there's also that, and then potentially even if it changes in the IA, if content has to be shifted, the IA might change, the information architecture and where it lives might change. Therefore, the tone and the angle of the content might actually we need to be updated as well. And then sometimes it's just realigning with the new department and making sure that it works.
So it's not really like content migration is a too simplified term for this. What we're really talking about is content transformation.
So there are two parts to that, right? So if content is moving, yeah, there's the migration, the technical migration, but then naturally the part of the content transformation, as you mentioned, is really that alignment with the new site, the target site, right? So if something's coming in, making sure that content transformation aligns with the rest of the site. And if there's a shuffle of content or a vacuum of content, then making sure that the rest of the content around that is also transformed, even if it stays in the same site. So yeah, it's also a good opportunity to kind of clean house and do this kind of content life cycle, making sure everything is up to date and not necessarily not yeah, having get rid of unnecessary content. If you can reduce bloat for the site, it's obviously better for the user to be able to not have to wade through 1,000 pages to find content. They only have to wade through maybe 10 pages. That's way easier. And so that what's really been helping here is kind of AI or artificial intelligence and program machine learning is starting to play a real helpful role here in kind of helping with manage some of these ways of looking after content.
Yeah, I hear that that comes up a lot, like, and more so, like as the months tick by, it's just moving so quickly. So, in your opinion, how do you see AI supporting the content work during a MOG?
So with government, there's still plenty of conversation of how much AI can be used, just because of the way the technology works and where the content lives, and mainly around the sovereignty of the content and the data. But the idea would be that to help augment the process and all the heavy lifting. So naturally, you can still use some degree of automation, even just by crawling a site and then having a look at how many pages there are. The some crawl. Um, Services or even solutions. We've got something that's called it's an open source tool called Merlin that we use for migrations. But part of that is crawling. So we can have a look at a site, and we actually use that for the 20,000 example that I mentioned before, the 20,000 pages. It crawled the site, was able to kind of look and index the pages as well and the content. So we're able to tell that's how we knew how many pieces of content there were because it crawls a public site. It was able to actually find things that are orphaned as well, right? If we're looking at the back end from a Drupal backend, especially, and looking at the page list and the content listing, we may not see the necessarily all of the content. You'll see some orphans and things, and where it's connected. Or if you're going through the website and just going through the links, you may not see everything there. But some sort of automated tools can definitely help with that kind of first pass. Now, in terms of content development, that's definitely useful, but yeah, it could get tricky on some of the more nuanced languages and content and topics that are around for government. So there's probably a little bit of time left to get that kind of going at full speed, but it could help with the first pass of checking tone and language is probably the where I'd be starting at.
So what I'm hearing is the human still leads, but the machine helps keep the pace, especially when you're under pressure, like you can be during a mock change.
Yeah, it's like having a supercharged intern or a content analyst, right? You can have someone who'll do all the basic stuff and then get through a lot more and still have a senior or an actual human making sure that the final pass and the final review is done. So that does speed up and shortcut the process, and can save hours and days potentially. You can also make it do more specific things like triage, create summaries, and things like that. So it can free up people to do other things that are more sensitive.
Hey, Akil, we've run out of time again. Let's finish up and pick up again next week.
Yes, sure thing. That'd be great.
Thanks for tuning into Salsa Digital's The Mog Effect, Inside the Chaos and How to Gain Clarity when Managing Government Digital Transformation. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or leave a review on our YouTube channel. This helps us keep making content that helps digital teams stay one step ahead. You can also find links, resources, and episode notes on our website at salsa.digital.
And next time on the Mog Effect, we'll pick up on the content theme again and focus on design, branding, and maintaining trust through design. So stay calm and keep redirecting.
Thanks, Akil. See you next week.
Thanks, Julia. Have a great week.